Minister here with us today. For the purposes of the record, could you introduce yourselves from left to right, please?
I'm Chris Preston. I'm the Deputy Director for Waste and Recycling.
Therese Coffey, Environment Minister.
And Marie Fallon, the Director of Environment with the Director of Regulated Industry with the Environment Agency.
Lovely, thank you. You're all very welcome. Minister, perhaps I could start with a question to you. When we heard from Secretary of State on the 1st of November, we asked him about the China waste ban, and he seemed blissfully unaware of it, had to be passed a note from his official sitting behind him, proceeded to read it out to us, and then confessed he hadn't given it sufficient thought. Was that the first time he'd heard about it?
I know when I first heard about it, and I would say that I would hope that the Secretary of State has confidence in his junior minister to work with officials to get on top of the detail and sort these kinds of issues out.
But also to brief him about a looming crisis in our waste industry, surely. Had you personally briefed him on this matter before he came to us?
Had I personally briefed him, I don't recall personally briefing him, but I challenge the view that it's a crisis affecting the industry.
OK, well, we'll hear some industry comments on that. Surely, as a ministerial group you meet on a weekly basis, was this not something you thought to flag with him?
Well, as I say, we set to work together, and Chris Preston is the responsible official. We had a discussion about what to do. We started then working across government, because there are formal notifications, whether it's about engaging our embassy in Beijing to do an informal element, but in reality the EU is our spokesperson at the WTO, so it was about working with the EU and our Department for International Trade to go through the formal process, because we believed it was worth challenging through the World Trade Organization.
OK, so you have relied on our membership of the EU to raise this at the WTO. We heard from the industry yesterday that they felt that government had taken their eye off the ball in terms of developing a home market for these goods. Would you agree that that's correct?
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think, as you're aware, and the Secretary of State announced formally last year in his WWF speech, building on work that had already kind of been crystallising, that we were planning a new resources and waste strategy. As part of the clean growth strategy, we articulated the need to create a better secondary markets for a lot of materials. At the end of the day, countries like China, Turkey, Vietnam buy this plastic waste product from us because its value has been valuable to them in creating products which they then sell back to us. So that's a nature of free market, open markets.
Have you raised this with your colleague Liam Fox or with the Prime Minister? The Prime Minister arrived in China this morning. Liam Fox arrived in China on the 2nd of January. Has this been raised at the highest levels with the Chinese government? And if not, why not?
Well, I think to some extent the ship has sailed. China is perfectly entitled to decide that it's going to...
So that's a no, but it hasn't been. You haven't raised it with them to raise with the Chinese government directly?
No.
No. Because this is a $219 million a year export on plastics and $700 million a year export on paper. I mean, this is £1 billion worth of export. It's not all going to China, it's going to the EU, it's going to other countries, but this is $1 billion worth of UK trade. It's only seen as rubbish, but it is still a significant part of our export.
Well, I think if it was seen as rubbish, we'd be paying other people to take it off our hands, and it's not. It's trade. The estimated export value of the plastics, particularly to China, is estimated at about £85 million. We actually export far more paper than plastics. So of the 3.7 million tonnes of plastic waste generated, about 8.8 million was exported to other countries around the world, and about 0.4 of that to China, including Hong Kong. That's actually falling from previous years. I think we've seen something like a 30% reduction since 2010. And other markets have grown. So places like Turkey, what the market has shown is that other countries have decided to take some more of that waste. But a lot of this will depend on the market price.
We visited a recycling centre in East London last week, and what the market told us there is that stuff that was selling for £100 a tonne, contaminated paper, before Christmas, is selling for £20 a tonne this week. The market has an oversupply, lack of demand because of the closure of the China market, and this could soon feed through into gate fees and council tax bills. What's your response?
Well, what we don't know yet, I mean, to be clear, that the places like Germany have been exporting more waste to China than us.
And the US.
And the US. So this is something that has, the reason why not passing on to the EU is the representative of the EU member states at the WTO. Of course, when we leave the European Union, we'll have our own seat at the WTO. So that is the appropriate forum when it was believed that the way that the Chinese government had gone about it was not appropriate. So that was the right forum to do it. So what we are not clear about yet, it's too soon to tell, is whether this is a temporary reaction to the glut. There is a glut of material on the market, and that's reduced prices. So is that going to be structural? It's actually too early to tell. But as I say, other markets are taking up some of these, and I expect there will be a price realignment. There certainly has been in the short term, and that's why we're seeing people holding on to stocks here, waiting to see what's going to happen with the prices. One of the priorities for the Environment Agency has been to make sure that, dare I say, the permitting regulations, permits are respected. And actually, we are more worried about the paper that's being stockpiled than we are about the plastic.
Okay, well, there's far more of it, and there's obviously a fire risk.
Yeah.
We heard from the British Plastics Federation that they warned DEFRA of an impending crisis in China as early as 2012. There's been the Green Fence initiative, and before this, the Sword initiative. How did DEFRA address the British Plastic Federation's concerns back then?
Well, I have to say that's news to me. I did come into post 18 months ago, but that wasn't there. I mean, we should also be clear that China has not banned all forms of plastic import. There are certain kinds of plastic that's the post-consumer. They have tightened the contamination standards, and there are other materials affected as well, like scrap metals and so on. But I'm not aware of that. Chris, I don't know how long you've been in post, but are you aware of this?
Not since 2012, no. In terms of China's tightening restrictions, I think that is probably true to say, and I think the market has adjusted. Bear in mind, this is an open market. There's an extent to which government can create the framework for how those markets operate. We have done things like improve the quality of information available around the quality of recycling, to improve quality, that kind of thing. But actually, I think the speed with which the Chinese implemented the changes was much faster, much quicker than anybody, including the industry and government, I would say to some extent, expected. So you asked about have we engaged with places like Beijing, have we engaged with others. At official level, we certainly engaged with the Department for International Trade, we certainly engaged with our embassy in Beijing to make sure we understood what was going on and to gather intelligence, to get to work with Chinese authorities around things like enforcement and control back in December. We got feedback on how the Chinese authorities were going to enforce the ban, because that was a really big issue for the industry. To be honest, there was a lot of uncertainty about China's proposals, which made it very, very difficult for industry to plan for whether their products could meet new contamination rates. And I also understand that the Environment Agency is out there probably now actually talking to Chinese authorities about how the ban is going to be enforced.
So it is a ban, it's not restrictions.
Well, some are simply not being accepted anymore, while other elements are. Chris has the full detail of the different materials, but I think it's 24 materials in total.
Yeah, so 24 materials banned, and then tighter contamination levels on other materials. Again, that was another area of uncertainty for business, because China's original proposals were a 0.3 contamination rate, which would have been, well, actually very challenging for the industry to meet. Those rates are now around about 0.5 to 1%, depending on the type of material. So,
I mean, just to be clear, it's $1 billion of our exports. We've got ministers and the Prime Minister over there at the moment, but you don't think, Minister, that it's worth having a chat with the Chinese government about?
Well, as I've articulated, our estimated value of the plastic exports is about £85 million.
So we can afford to just shrug and move on and find somewhere else for that. But it will go. No, it will be less, won't it?
I think that the ship has sailed, and China is enforcing the rules that they've set out, which they're perfectly entitled to do.
Okay, we'll move on. Thank you for this. Sorry.
You said that the Secretary of State became aware of this in this committee on the 1st of November. And you then said you know when you became aware of it. When was that you became aware of the problem yourself?
I was alerted on the 20th of July.
Okay, thank you.
And then we met as a group of, with my officials, and that set off the work across government.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. John.
Thank you. Minister, you had meetings with industry stakeholders in September 2017, in which you were advised to take urgent action, but industry stakeholders have described the government action as woefully insufficient. So can you outline some steps or agreed actions that you've taken with the Environment Agency, SEPA or the Department for Trade following this meeting?
Well, I think actually we've been handling it rather well. We've been seeking to, as Chris explained, gather more certainty about what the impact of the actual proposed ban from China was. The EA has been working on its side of, in terms of, I say, working with sites, but also the management of the whole process of that side of the export. We haven't had a single local council contact us, so we did outreach there and with their represented bodies. So I would say there's been an ongoing dialogue, and I understand why industry is concerned, because there was a huge amount of uncertainty, and that's why we've been diligently trying to get as much clarity as possible in order to inform industry of the changes. Meanwhile, as I say, we've seen people make sure they get into other markets as well, and there's a downward trend to China, and I'm always happy for us to try and help industry if there's specifically needs where they need access to help access to other markets. But actually, they've already responded themselves.
The timelines, Minister, you know, this was September 2017, and all this, I think, is coming into force by March. You know, so they're asking for urgent action, and I would just like some clarity on where this urgent action is actually taking place.
Well, as I articulated, a lot of what they were looking for is a bit more clarity on what that did. Of course, there'll be some parts of the industry who say we need instantly more capacity in this country right now. Actually, the industry can come forward with their own capacity if that's what they wish. But meanwhile, there are other markets which have been accepting this waste, and we have been trying to facilitate as best we can the knowledge of how the industry can respond. I'm not sure there's anything particularly more I can add.
Well, I mentioned if you had any particular conversations with the Environment Agency, SEPA or the Department for Trade, because they were involved in the discussions.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you had a, you know,
well, Marie,
I think what I'm trying to get here, if you agreed some actions with them about where you're going, and I would quite like, if possible, to hear what they are.
Yeah, perhaps I could help.
Yeah.
My teams and Chris's teams have been working together for some months when we were aware of this potential issue. And like we say, we've been trying to understand the clarity around what did the restrictions mean in terms of the permits that we regulate. And also working with industry themselves. We work with a number of the trade bodies, many of them who were here yesterday, the Environmental Services Association, Chartered Institute of Waste Management, etc. And what I was really keen to do was to understand from them what were the challenges that they face within their sector. So what intelligence did they have from their members? Because they will obviously know from a commercial perspective what was happening in the market, because obviously it's a global market. For my own team, I wanted to make sure that we understood what was happening on the site, so with the producers. And so what we know where the producers are, which we regulate in terms of the permits. So what we've been able to do is to give further advice and guidance to our teams on the ground. What we've been then also been able to do is to understand where the waste is going from and to in the areas that we regulate. Obviously, we don't regulate everything, but in terms of the areas we do regulate, what we've been trying to do is to understand where those waste movements are going. And we've then been able to work with the sites, because I think the concern that's been raised by industry is about the issue about stockpiling and whether the sites have got sufficient capacity. Now, we all know from your own constituency the challenges we face when we've got waste sites which are often close to residential properties. So our first priority is to understand the risks around the management of sites and to make sure that they are operating within their permits. And what we've been able to do is give guidance to our staff at a local level in case they are approached by any operator about increasing their permit size in terms of the waste they store. So far, and we have created a network among our officers to get very quick intelligence back, we're not hearing anything specific in terms of requests. However, that's not to say we're complacent, because we recognise that, you know, the market can change, and obviously we've seen alternative markets come to the fore recently, but obviously they're starting to get capacity, so we may see that increase. So our role is very much to make sure that the sites that are asking for the additional capacity, that they are appropriate, they are not going to create any risks, because obviously we know, you probably know of our work around trying to reduce the risks of fire, and that's obviously a concern around paper. And so what we're trying to do is to manage that down. But so, you know, I'm confident at the moment that we've got the right intelligence, and that we're working with the operators, and again working with the trade bodies, that we can be able to, if there's any you know, feedback from trade bodies, that on a national scale we'll be able to capture that.
So you issued some fresh guidance, didn't you? I think, was it last month?
Yeah.
So that people are clear on the obligations that they have. So that's the kind of, I say, giving clarity to people on the best that we can of the information that we can ascertain, either directly or through the EU.
Okay, my next question was, one action point from the meeting was to contact the Chinese directly in order to scope out potential scenarios for each affected material. So did DEFRA do this? And if so, were the potential scenarios for each material discussed with the industry?
I know that there was informal contact through our mission. I will turn to Chris to understand precisely, because I didn't see the minutes of that particular meeting.
Yeah,
I trust my officials to follow up.
So two aspects. So we focused mainly on the two most affected materials, so plastic and paper, because that's potentially the biggest risk to human health and the environment if something happens with those. So that's where our attention has been. But we've carried out analysis on the size and scale of the problem across all the materials. I'm not quite sure I understand the question. So are you asking, did we talk to industry about what they were doing in terms of finding alternative markets, or ask them, is there something that
potential
you would
scenarios
like
for each affected material? Yeah.
Say that again, sorry.
It's to scope out potential, the actual phrase is potential scenarios. So you tell me you've scoped out all the potential scenarios for what the eventualities might happen here.
So for sure. So this is why it's actually important to understand what the scale and nature of the banned materials are, so that you can decide what your response is going to be around that. So the UK exports, if you take paper, something like 3.7 million tonnes of paper to China. The ban doesn't actually preclude, as the information about what the ban might actually entail became clearer and more available. Something like 1.1 million tonnes of paper is mixed paper. That is automatically banned. So there's potentially an issue around that. So we need to think about what the impact of that might be on local authorities, on waste operators, on waste sites. And again, part of this is about actually managing those waste sites to make sure that the risk to human health and the environment is minimised. And at the same time, talking to industry about what plans they have, what they were doing to open up new markets. And it's quite clear when you look at the data, as we analyse that as well, so it's tracking data and information. Unfortunately, slightly with a time lag, there's not real-time data because some of it's input by industry itself. So, we don't always have real-time information. But we therefore tracked what was happening, looked at where new markets were opening up, some new markets for paper and plastics as well. So I think what we've seen is that the industry has responded over time. But as I say, our immediate response was to try and understand what industry thought about what they would like government to do. I mean, I think this is really important. So in our conversations with industry, the question is, I did ask the question either privately on one-on-one conversations, is there anything you particularly want us to do? And actually the big thing that came back from that is make things better for the future, so about, for example, our waste and resources strategy, and look into that for the future about how we can, this is a short-term issue that needs to be managed, but this is what we want you to do in the future. And it's produced your waste and resource strategy.
So do you think that the response to the China ban can be guided by the industry alone, or does the government intend to provide direction? Now, when I was reading these things, it reminded me of Pierre Trudeau in America when he talked about America, and he says, well, America is the elephant in the lotus side. And when that elephant moves over, we've got to react. And in this case, I think China is the elephant in the room, and I would hope that we would be a cheetah and not the sloth.
Well, As alluded to earlier, and as I've mentioned in previous inquiries, we are working on a resources and waste strategy, and there is a clear desire to improve the stimulate secondary markets, particularly I'm thinking here of the plastic side of life. I think it would probably be worthwhile just explaining that contamination gets used in two ways when we talk about waste. One is what you would expect, dirt. The other bit is about, in effect, different grades of, and that's where you end up with the concept of mixed waste actually being considered contaminated, and how different grades of paper, or whether you keep plastic windows and stuff like that. That's where, in the past, a lot of that could just be sent off and somebody else could process that for you. That's the kind of restrictions as well that also gets called contaminated waste. It's not just about, as I say, stuff that you wouldn't necessarily want, is perfectly clean. I think that's what I'm putting. But I'm conscious of the increasing desire to see our resources and waste strategy, and that's why I'm very pleased that we continue to make progress, but we're not ready yet.
Okay, well, I'm happy with that. But I think that, we are a huge exporter to China on our waste, and we don't want to put worst case scenario, but you can see it coming. Thanks.
Yes, go on.
Supplementary. Just thinking, this is the supply side. Can't quite understand the demand side. What is China doing for raw material to make cardboard and paper at the moment? Because that leads on to where this is going and how long this may last.
So this is only based on this is kind of based on what I read around the industry and talking to the industry. So for things like plastic, it looks like plastic operations in China are relocating to other countries in the sort of surrounding Southeast Asia region, and they will probably take some of the plastic from the world, which will then be processed and then sold on into China. But there may well be a shortfall in terms of, so they may well turn to more virgin material for production of some of their products. That's only speculation, but there will be a gap in terms of because they talk about 50% of the world's plastic and paper, so there will potentially be a gap. Again, talking to the industry, I'm not an expert on building and making paper mills, but it's probably easier to move a plastics recycling facility than it is a paper mill, which is much bigger. So, again, reading the kind of trade press around it, things like paper prices from China, so cardboard box and things, prices of those things are allegedly increasing. But that's just what I've read in the press in terms of what the impact in paper prices in China. So there is possibly a knock-on cost from that. But that's based on press reports, not kind of deep analysis done by government.
If we've heard anything from our recycling industry here and what we've seen at the plant we visited, is that the standard of what we're sending is probably among the highest. So their only alternative is to use virgin stocks material to produce cardboard in the future.
Or material from other countries in the surrounding region that has been sorted to meet the new standards.
Yeah.
So.
No label.
Or from the UK as well, if we ship materials that have met there. Because bear in mind, it's mixed consumer plastics that are affected as well. So that's basically stuff that we throw out from our houses. But you can also have post-industrial plastics, so I don't say offcuts from factories, some of which they've set lower contamination levels for, but that could still be shipped. But again, uncertainty for the industry because we're not quite sure how that will be enforced at the Chinese side, which is why the Environment Agency's gone out to actually try and understand what it means in practice for our industry.
It is one of the risks, of course, of having a persistently low oil price.
Yes. So as much about economics.
So
there's
I'm
nothing
sure that'll be
we can
addressed.
do about that.
So I'm sure that'll be addressed in your resources and waste strategy. And Minister, when was that announced and decided that would happen? Was it after this ban was announced?
No. I can't remember when Michael's speech was, but this has been preparing for some time. It's quite significant what we're trying to change. Yes, there's been change of Secretary of State, there's been change of ministers in other departments, so it is taking longer than perhaps we'd have all loved to have done, but it's important we get it right because I think it's going to be quite a radical shift.
Okay, so when was the speech? Do we know?
I can't remember.
27th of July, it was his Frozen Moment speech to WWF.
Okay, and the ban was announced before that?
On the 8th, well, they submitted
earlier.
the documents on the 18th.
The two are not linked.
Yeah, on the 18th of July.
So it's pure coincidence,
Absolutely.
especially because he was totally unaware of it till he came to this committee on November the 1st.
Well,
as we've
I'm not
recently
gonna-
established.
I think I recall him saying he hadn't given it sufficient thought.
Okay.
I'm not sure he said he hadn't given it any thought.
Okay. Right. So what assessment have you made about the reduced import licences for cardboard and what effect this could have on UK recycling? What do you think is going to happen?
I'm actually not sure I quite understand your question, sorry.
So there's fewer licences. There's this 1.1 million tonnes. It's a bit of a follow-up, really, from Colin's question about, you know, there was 3.7 million tonnes of paper. Now, 1.1 million tonnes of that is simply not going to go there. How is this going to percolate through into our recycling industry?
Well, I think the industry has to consider whether or not there are alternative markets for that. My understanding is that they have been able to start to find some markets. We recognise that there's stockpiling happening at the moment while people are adjusting their business models, but I'm not quite clear. I'm still not quite clear I fully understand what you're getting at.
Okay, well, we'll move on to the stockpiling question, and I'm sure the answers will emerge. Colin.
Well, just on that, then, we've heard that recyclable material has been stockpiling since October, which you've just said, Minister. What assessment have you made of the storage capacity in UK facilities?
My understanding from the EA, I think, is that we believe we have sufficient capacity to do that. I know people are very conscious that there's this idea we'll just burn everything if we run out of capacity. Clearly, that's better than landfilling the waste. But at the moment, I thought our assessment was we're okay at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, a permit will have a capacity of the site, and that doesn't always mean the operator has the site filled to that capacity, so there is always movement around the capacity in the UK. And I guess that's what we're talking about here, is that in terms of that capacity at the moment, we're not seeing a dramatic request for extending capacity limits or stockpiling on sites.
So is there enough capacity for material that's been affected immediately by this ban?
That's what we're seeing. We're not seeing anybody coming in and saying, you know, we need to suddenly expand our site by 100%.
I mean, Nordo issued a press release at the beginning of this month saying they don't think they are seeing quite the level of stockpiling that perhaps was forecast was going to happen. That's just our concern, and that's why the EA have added resource to be alert and on top of the issue. Yeah.
So obviously, with sort of following on from that, and if there is a risk, it is a fire. And obviously, the EA will be checking that. I mean, what assessment have you made of the risk of stock fires because of the stockpiling?
Well, every site that's got, if it's got a particular requirement for a fire prevention plan, it would have to provide that to us. So there are certain sites where we consider them to be a higher risk than others because of their location or the particular materials that they are storing, and we require them to provide us with a fire prevention plan which sets out what they would do in case of a fire and what mitigation measures, and it might be about reducing the amount of waste on the site if the risk is too high. Then in terms of if we're seeing increases in amounts being stored over and above their permit, then we would obviously take action against the individuals and try and prevent it. We can suspend the notice and stop the operator taking waste on, but that's obviously last resort. What we try and do is obviously work with the operators, and that's what we've been trying to ensure our local staff are fully briefed on what they need to do and give us any feedback at a national level.
So is there an increased risk of waste crime, and what are you doing to regulate it? Because if it is building up, people might use other ways of getting rid of it.
Yeah, I mean, the organisations or the companies that tend to export tend to be the more legitimate companies. And that's not to say we don't see illegal activity in exporting. We do significant checks at the number of ports around exporting, but that's very much on an intelligence-led basis. We have lots of means of finding out what's happening with waste, working with other agencies, HMRC, Border, etc., and police. So we're able to do targeted inspections, which we've found to be very, very effective, and we've actually stopped exports going out of the country, and sometimes they've had to be repatriated, but that's working with the shipping lines around that. But, you know, waste crime, it's the nature of the industry in some aspects, and that's why we're working with the department and with other colleagues to try and look at ways to reduce waste crime. We're having some impact on that. We've had additional resources in the budget to support us in that work, and we're continuing to do a lot more work to try and reduce it. But I think it's the inevitable fact that, you know, where there is, where I come from, where there's muck, there's brass, and it's exactly, you know, people will make money from waste, and what we've got to try and do is to do our best to reduce it. And we are very effective, but it is an ongoing challenge for the industry and for ourselves.
Okay, Zach?
Yeah, just a quick one. While talking about capacity, I just want to know whether or not you are aware, there's no reason why you should be, but I want to know whether or not you're aware that Lakeside Energy from Waste plant, which is, it takes in around 430,000 tonnes a year of waste from 12 London councils, about 4% of the UK's non-recyclable waste, is going to have to close down to make way for the third runway, if it happens, which I highly doubt. But if it were to happen, you would see the required closure of one of the biggest waste plants in the country. I just wonder whether or not, given this additional pressure that's arisen as a consequence of China's policy, whether or not that's also on the radar, because it's a very significant piece of capacity that would be lost, and there's no idea where it would go.
You're right to say it is a significant. It was not part of my thinking in preparing for this session, but I'm sure that the Secretary of State for Transport will be made aware that we need to think. I mean, the National Infrastructure Commission is assessing major infrastructure needs, including that for waste, and given they have huge interest in the future of aviation, we'll make sure we alert them as well. Thank you.
Just to come back to my earlier question on the Chinese licences, we heard yesterday that China's only issued import licences for 10% of the tonnage of cardboard that they've previously accepted. Is there any indication from them whether that's going to be it, or whether it's going to be done on a month-by-month basis? What's your intelligence?
It's still not clear. In fact, I asked for us to check this out, so we still don't know the answer to that. We do know that some other markets are starting to take paper, like Vietnam and Malaysia, but we're not clear on the situation on that.
So we've got your colleagues, the Prime Minister and the Trade Minister, over there, but we don't think it's worth raising, you know, this multi-million-pound industry with at the highest levels. It just seems a missed opportunity.
I note your concern.
Okay. All right, we'll move on. Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, moving on to local authorities now. What assessment have you made of the falling price of recycled material and its impact on local authorities?
Well, this is a recent situation. We are conscious the market price has fallen. But as I say, there has been a glut of material, a global glut. And as I say, no council proactively contacted us. We wrote out to over the 245 authorities, I think it is. And we are engaging with the local government association, with the Nordo and LARAC and so on. My understanding is that companies are still taking this off their hands, but it will be a collection. It's kind of like that intermediary. At the moment, the councils are still passing their materials on. And we just need to wait, I'm afraid, Alex, to find out whether this is a permanent change or a temporary glut. But it's not feeding through yet that we're aware of in affecting local authorities, but of course it's something we are sensitive to. I know Chris has done some more work on this, so would you like to add some more?
Yeah, so I think the impact on local authorities will actually depend on the nature of the local authority's arrangement with its waste provider, so either in-house or contracted out. So that it does add quite a significant level of complexity to trying to do modelling and analysis to try and understand what that impact will be. So, for example, if a local authority is contracted out to Suez, we know that Suez has kind of made public statements that they no longer ship paper or plastic to China. So you would expect that local authorities served by Suez and waste services from Suez wouldn't be affected. But we don't hold centrally that kind of information. So it's a case of actually gathering information, as much information in as we can, to properly understand what the impact is going to be. Some local authorities may have deals with domestic reprocessors, so potentially not affected, but actually there is a knock-on effect because that domestic reprocessing could be displaced by stuff that previously went to China. So it's a very complicated model, which is why actually which is why we've contacted local authorities to gather that information, so we get real-time rather than modelled information, so we can properly respond and work with them on a proper response. So that's kind of the broad answer to that.
If it does feed through into a permanent drop in price and it affects the model that local authorities work on, can you envisage providing local authorities increased funding?
I can genuinely say that isn't a matter where I can give you any answer at all. As you know, the whole concept of local government finance is shifting to business rates and so on.
So, right, I understand that. So in terms of the public perception of this, obviously we've had Blue Planet, particularly around plastics, a much bigger public understanding of what happens to plastic. If local authorities change their patterns and public confidence is lost in terms of what they do when they put their plastics and the materials in the recycling, what steps have you taken to ensure local authorities don't have to take a backward step in recycling collection because of loss of public confidence in the service?
Well, clearly we want to continue to councils to do what they can to increase the amount of recycling that happens with their residents and businesses indeed. I think that I don't think people are linking this concept of the China situation, no longer wanting to buy certain kinds of waste from UK markets, should in any way deter people from thinking that they still need to do the right thing. If something, there might be a benefit that we're able to say to consumers and residents, actually take even more care of how you recycle what you're doing, so the quality of the recycling gets higher. And that's what helps councils and indeed other processors get better return for the money if the quality of the product that they are selling is higher. So somewhere like Cleantech in Lincolnshire will show you this is the average sort of bale you get from the processor or the intermediary on behalf of a council or direct from a council. Here's where it is in some other parts of the European Union. We need to be a lot better. So it may well be sensible for us to take the opportunity to alert consumers that the more they do to make sure that the recycling that they put out on their doorstep, and I genuinely hope in the future that will include Rotherham on their plastic bottles, is that they will help their own councils get more money, which will help them with the collection service and potentially their council tax.
You said it may be sensible. Do you have any plans to do that?
I must admit, it hasn't been my top priority to think about how we take this particular situation and turn it into a recycling comms campaign, but it's given me food for thought.
Yeah.
And is this something you've raised with your colleagues in the local government DCLG department in any formal way?
I haven't at ministerial level. I've spoken with LGA people directly. I don't know at official level if we have.
Yeah, so we talk, on all matters waste and recycling, because HCLG is the kind of lead government department for local government. We would always discuss any matters relating to this, including China, actually, with them as well.
Okay, thank you. Zach?
Thanks very much. You will be aware, not least from the evidence that we've had, that industry and environmental groups are worried that the oversupply of recyclable material will result in more landfill. So I'm just wondering, what can you and what have you done in terms of sending regulatory signals to avoid that from happening or prevent that from happening?
Well, industry is aware that we are preparing a resources and waste strategy. They're aware of the signals that we've put in things like the Clean Growth Strategy and the 25-year Environment Plan about improving the secondary markets for materials. They'll be aware of quite a lot of the different speeches or contributions that have been made. We are considering whether we should set regulatory limits on the proportion of recyclate going into materials. They'll be aware of, from the 25-year Environment Plan, zero avoidable waste. So I would hope that there's enough out there for them to recognise that there's going to be some quite radical shifts. It's
do
the last
you
thing
think that's been factored in already by the industry? Do they have, how much of an idea do you think the industry has as to what those regulatory shifts might look like?
I expect you'll get a mixed opinion from industry. I think the savviest ones are seeing it and we're seeing changes. I mean, as you're aware, we've got this group, we're looking at the whole business about the recycling of plastic bottles and cups and so on. And the challenge about a lot of these things, we need to get the resources and waste strategy right. And rather than too much drip feed, I don't want to give too many misleading signals. We are thinking about a number of different ideas. Those are well known by the industry. What I think is fair to say is the industry is very keen and would like us to finish our resource and waste strategy as quickly as possible.
Can I mean, surely one of the ways to minimise the risk of contamination, and by that I don't mean chemical, I mean contamination in the sense of weakening the recycling stream, is to restrict the choice that's available in terms of the different plastics that are usable. But that's something that I think the Secretary of State has mentioned in various forums. I think you have as well. But is that something the industry is taking seriously?
Yes.
Do they think that will happen?
I mean, in particular, you'll be aware of the call for evidence by the Treasury that we're working on with them about charges and levies on single-use plastics. There are seven plastic categories, a variety of different things, some of which are very significant, can be easily recycled, others which, frankly, are difficult. They can be done, but it's not always straightforward, you know, whether that's your glasses or whatever it is. So, in particular, on things like the black plastic and other kinds of plastic when it comes to food, the Co-op is leading an industry group where they're looking at trying to reduce the number of polymers that are used and therefore make it much more straightforward to recycle a number of these products in the future.
We've heard from EcoSuritude, a compliance specialist. They've told us that the UK, this is a quote, the UK is nowhere near ready to recycle the additional plastics at home. I mean, do you agree with that?
I don't know who EcoSurity are. I would suggest that we have a variety of infrastructure in this country. Chris knows I get infuriated somewhat when people just say plastic can't be recycled or black plastic. It can be. Yeah. It's whether or not people are prepared to put the investment in with the detectors and so on. Yeah. So I would accept is that the level of capability we would like is not as widespread as we would like.
Okay. And I can ask one more question. What regulations are in place to ensure that packaging export recovery notes are not given out for unrecyclable materials?
Well, that's where my expert comes in, because it's her job. Well, not her.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the exporters' responsibility to make sure they comply with the package recovery notes. And obviously what we do is we have a process of checking the information on those notes, and we have a relationship with other countries where we know they're going to be assured that the regulatory standards are equivalent to what they are in the UK. So, and it's a relatively small part of our work. So, and it's now that we've got connected links around the world. So, it's not an area I'm as worried about compared to some of the other parts of the business.
I'm aware of the complaints of the industry that they feel there are different standards.
So you are aware?
I am aware of the complaints of the industry that they believe that there are different standards.
The different standards. What are the penalties for? I mean, how common is non-compliance?
It's not as common as in other parts of the waste industry, and where it does occur, we are able to often work with the exporters around it. But we have taken action against them. Very rare. It's not as frequent.
What is it? Sorry, I have to take. What are the penalties?
It's ultimately prosecution against a company.
And there have been prosecutions.
There has been, yeah, not very many, but I can certainly provide details of that if the committee would like further details, rather than me trying to.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, if pounds are given for contaminated waste, does that mean the calculation of UK recycling targets are based on the inclusion of unrecyclable waste? Is that correct?
Chris, do you want to say something?
Shouldn't be issued for contaminated waste is the point. So
yes.
To ship waste on that basis would be wrong.
Be
fraud, in fact, actually, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
But the point
But
is China's
accepting the
banned
point
it
that-
because it's contaminated. So obviously a percentage of what we're sending is contaminated and isn't recyclable, even in China with their much lower labour costs. But I think that's the point we're trying to get to.
Well, it's also mixed plastics as well, so rather than just contamination. So things that would have been perfectly acceptable before that might have been 100%, but all mixed plastics are no longer allowed. And actually, I think this is a regulatory issue, so Marie might have to correct me, but in terms of the consignment notes that go over it, can often say the splits of different types of material on there as well.
So would that be things like coffee cups with the paper and then the plastic, which would be not contaminated but mixed paper and therefore unrecyclable? So we're saying it's recycled even though it isn't really.
Well, this is why Environment Agency have taken action to produce the guidance to export the potential exporters to say these things can no longer be exported to that particular market.
Are coffee cups included in that guidance?
They will be, yes. I mean, there's the when you have plastics, obviously there's a level where there's things like glue and things adhered to the plastic, which is where the de minimis arrangements come in. And although we don't specify what it needs to be, obviously that's where we would work with the companies to make sure and do the inspections to make sure what they're saying on their consignment notes is correct in terms of the material that they're exporting. Because obviously you can't take everything off a plastic item, but that's where, you know, it's about reasonableness, but it's trying to minimise the amount of contamination that would be in an exported material.
And do you have any oversight about what happens to that stuff when it ends up in the end market in terms of whether or not it is recycled?
We do in terms of working with our equivalent regulators in the countries of the destination countries. So where it goes to, we have a reciprocal arrangement with the regulators over there in the same way as if waste is coming here, they will contact us if they had any concerns.
I was about to say it's a two-way, isn't it? Because I think you've told me in the past about where some countries have said that place, do not send your waste there.
Yeah.
And if the consignment notice trying to suggest it can go there, that's where it gets stopped.
Yeah.
And you can't send it to reprocessor A, but you can because they're no longer declared fit for purpose by their own regulator.
And we have refused consignment notes on that basis, that we don't feel that the destination is fit.
And have you ever come across examples where car engines have been put in, for example? I heard that. Where the paper is watered to increase its weight.
There are all sorts of tricks that are tried to try and pass off recyclates. Myself and Chris both visited the site at Felixstowe, and we saw some of the interesting arrangements that exporters try and to get around the legislation, and that's why I say we work very closely in terms of intelligence-led, and we're able to try and prevent that happening. But inevitably there will be some which will get round us, but I think I can reassure the members here that we do take a proactive approach on a risk-based basis to try and reduce that, and we are very successful working with other regulators to prevent that happening.
And what sort of creative approaches were they using?
Well, for example, we are one of the things we're doing recently is using smart water on waste that is maybe illegal waste to prevent us to be able to track it if it's moved. We also are having tracking devices on waste so that we can see where it actually ends up around the world, and working with other law enforcement agencies to track that waste, so that where we suspect that there is illegal activity, we're gathering evidence to help us then in future prosecutions.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Robert.
In the Secretary of State's written ministerial statement addressing the China ban, the emphasis was on finding alternative export markets for waste. But we've heard that the world's recyclers are attempting to pour a pint into a half-pint glass. Is exporting waste a sustainable long-term solution, both environmentally or indeed economically?
Well, the Prime Minister, he's not. The Secretary of State has also talked about reducing plastic.
Paging Dr.
Sorry.
Sorry. Don't worry, your secret's safe with us.
I was thinking of the Prime Minister in the 25-year environment plan talked about tackling zero avoidable waste as our target and the element about plastic waste by 2042. So,
that make you the chance?
I'm just skipping ahead in my brain. I'm sorry. Not to any future scenario, just compressing two sentences into one. Sorry about that. So the Secretary of State has talked about having less plastic in effect within our consumer and retail and other environment. That's one of the things as part of the broader plan. And one of the things that you've just referred to, Zach, is about how do we get, in effect, fewer polymers, fewer different types of plastic, so it's more straightforward and easier for it to be recycled. As I've articulated before, pretty much any plastic can be recycled, but it's often not worthwhile economically to do so. Either it's very lightweight, it's difficult, it has to be transported to a particular place, and so on. So where I was going with that is that the markets, we have been exporting more because people still want our plastic waste, but I believe that we'll be in a situation, especially we're working on aspects of this with the resources and waste strategy. Our intention is to desire to have less plastic in the first place, and if we can grow our capacity at home in an economic fashion, that's good news. But at the end of the day, we still believe in open and free markets.
Obviously, there are other export markets open for waste still, but there are fears that other countries may bring in restrictions, and indeed, even if they don't, logistically, the empty containers are going back to China to be filled with Chinese goods, so there'll be additional costs there. How can you future-proof the UK recycling industry for this possibility that other export markets would be cut off from us?
Well, I think there almost always certainly will be a market, and the reason why people will export it is because they get a better price, I expect, from what they can get in this country at the moment for certain kinds of different waste. And that's not unique to plastic or paper, in where countries' economies add value to the reprocessing of waste. So we have we do have a certain amount of industry that can cope with that, and we export a certain amount, but we're actually processing a lot at home too.
Yeah, I mean, when you say add value, is it basically predicated upon the fact that they can employ people on much lower wages and much worse working conditions? So, are there real ethical concerns about alternative markets, and have you offered any guidance to the waste industry on which end markets would be acceptable in terms of their working conditions, and do you intend to make this information available to the public?
I haven't explored that. I'm not suggesting in any way that we should be having this as an exploitation. There are certain, for different reasons, often it's better to reprocess where the origin of the product is. So it may make sense for a lot of waste to go to the market or next door to where it's going to be reused again to generate new material. The markets work in different ways. It is a global market.
Do you think it's possible to carry out some of this work here in the UK, given our working conditions and wages, or is it, given that the more and more councils are mixing waste to up their recycling targets, that do you think there's a viable prospect of doing this sort of manual type of work here in the UK at all?
Well, you'll be aware that in certain parts of the country it's a challenge to get any labour at all domestically. I don't pretend to want to try and dictate how waste processors run their businesses in this country. We know the standards that we have in that, and it's a competitive market for a lot of the manual labour that we have, and in effect unskilled work, or work with a certain skill level which isn't as high as perhaps some of the most premium jobs in our country.
Okay. Slightly left field question.
Chris wanted to come in. I'm sure he can add more illumination.
All I was going to do is just add to what the Minister said. I mean, it depends on the material as well. So if you've got paper, there's 9.1 million tonnes of that potentially each year being produced. Could all that be used in the UK? It's an open question. Or does it make sense to ship it potentially for recycling to countries where it might get used to make packaging and things like that? So as a sensible kind of market approach, could we use, as the Minister said, create more material markets for plastics and recycled plastics? Quite possibly, things like recycled PET and things. And then other materials will always find a market around the world because they're desirable, so things like copper and things like that.
So we export waste to other places in the European Union? Yeah. Because frankly they're prepared to pay more for it than some of our domestic processes. So It is one of those where manufacturers and retailers will try and gather value from every element of their supply chain.
That actually neatly takes me on to my next question, because some recycling companies have managed to get export markets within the EU, and I know Germany buys waste for burning in their energy from waste plants, as does Sweden, and other types of waste can be recycled in EU countries. But you recently said that the UK could face increased waste export tariffs of between 3 and 7% if there's no deal with the EU. So will leaving the EU place further financial strain on the waste market?
Well, I think this was questions when we were at the Lords Select Committee, and I think I'm confident we will get a deal. But the committee, understandably, for the basis of their report, was stretching every possible scenario, just like any good Select Committee would do.
Thank you.
This one being no exception.
Indeed. That's what I'd expect my fellow members.
I think that's what our colleagues are debating right now in terms of the deal and the economic impact. Anyway, Matthew.
I wanted to explore the relationship between our desire, continued desire, increasing desire to export waste and the impact it's had upon commingled collection. I have a bugbear about this, that when I was responsible for recycling, I had the sorted collection, and that system was changed in Barnet.
You had what, sorry?
We had the sorted collection where consumers, our residents, myself, we would separate different items, put them in the box, and that changed. Would you say there's any relationship between this desire for commingled and at the same, as a result of the fact that so much was being exported to places like China?
Well, China was wanting to buy this product from us in order to fuel their economy of production. I don't have enough of a sense about whether commingling has changed the dynamics of what would get processed domestically or for exports purposes. I am conscious that the industry wants as little contamination as possible, whether that's dirt, and there are challenges, for example, about when you commingle glass and paper. There's definitely issues then that it's much more difficult. The risks are there about the shattering of glasses and therefore the contamination. That's a bit of a no-no. The Secretary of State has articulated he's keen to see greater consistency. We have encouraging greater consistency, but as I've articulated before, I don't think I am best placed to say to every single council in the country they need 7 or 8 bins, which would be the ideal sorting, if you like, to maximise entirely every single bit of value. People like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, when we've been discussing with them, they've suggested 3 or 4 would probably don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, and let's do more about that. And that's why we will continue to encourage councils, and RAP is our partner in doing this, in working on what we can do more to get greater consistency of recycling, certainly between neighbours. My limited experience so far, sadly, is that you end up with the lowest common factor, lowest common denominator rather than the highest common factor, and that's frustrating.
Certainly what comes from the discussion this afternoon is that this is a commodity rather than we see it as a waste product as we throw it away. But it is a commodity. But how do you feel, particularly as China said there's not going to take any more? Are you going to do anything to affect the export of waste? Meaning, are you going to change regulations through, particularly through the resources and waste strategy, to ensure that we domestically recycle more waste products?
Well, we're very keen to see more recycled, reused, recovered. As I've articulated the resources of waste strategy, we are considering about whether to put set minimum percentage recyclates in future materials. That would have a big impact on parts of the industry in that. So we need to be careful also in terms of how that will then affect the consumer. So it's about, that's why a lot of work is going into this at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Kerry.
There have been reports that the UK wouldn't sign up to the proposed new EU recycling targets. I think at the moment we're not on course to meet the current target of 50% by 2020. We're sort of flatlining around 44%. But there was reports that they're proposing a new target of 65%, and the UK wasn't prepared to go along with that. Can you explain why?
Well, there's been a trilogue discussion. The idea of a binding target for 65% in 2035 was actually introduced rather late into the discussion. I think I'm correct in saying we still don't actually have the formal text from the presidency. The presidency has just changed to Bulgaria, and we'll consider it carefully when it arrives.
So you're saying the reports that we were objected to it were premature? I'm just looking.
There are two different things going on. So that the 60% target and the 65% target are the weight-based measures of the recycling collected for household and municipal waste. I want to assure you that we exceed the specific targets for plastic recycling that the EU has today. So the current EU target for paper is 60%, we recycle 77%, for plastics it's 22.5%, we're recycling about 39%. So we're ahead of that in terms of the material types. The particular thing you're referring to is the weight-based measure. And a whole load of different changes have happened. I think we finally got to one calculation measure.
Yeah.
I'm not even clear that that's been agreed, so that's why we're waiting for the actual information to come from the trilogue discussions.
But we've signed up to a 50% by 2020 target.
Yeah.
Are we going to meet that?
We will be striving every sinew to achieve that, but we have been quite clear in other forums, and I think the Secretary of State said this again last week. The challenge at the moment is those kinds of targets are focused on weight, and it can lead to dare I say it, a lot of that is where we have it today is actually collecting garden waste, and whether that's the best way for council taxpayers' money to be going around trying to get garden waste. We actually think there's more sense in the future, and of course it'll be for a UK Parliament in the future to decide if we, at the end of our assessment, if we come forward with proposals to say, actually we think let's focus on what's got the most environmental benefits in terms of our resource effectivity and productivity. So at the moment we still need to get the full text of what's been proposed from the trilogue discussions, and then we'll consider that carefully for the next stages.
It sounds rather a lot like Badger's moving the goalposts or redefining child property to match.
Well, at the moment, Kerry, the challenges...
performance. But can I just say, yeah. The reports in the press said that UK officials were quite blunt in their opposition to the 65%. But also in the 25-year environment plan, there's a promise, isn't there, that you will meet all current targets and develop ambitious new ones. And from what you've said, it doesn't really sound like, you know, on the one hand you're saying we'll do our best to meet this target, but then on the other hand you're saying it's not a very good target because it's waste-based and it distorts, it's distorted by garden waste and so on.
As I say, that weight basis is only one of the aspects of the whole circular economy package.
But the 50% by 2020 target?
Yeah, I'm not going to deny that's a challenge. If it's Newham... Pardon?
And Wales.
And Wales, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not denying that.
So why are we finding it more difficult than Wales?
Well, I'm not quite sure what that's got to do with Chinese ban, but to answer your question...
it's all about recycling and what we do with our waste and whether we've got the capacity to recycle it. So I'd say it's very much related to, because if it's not going to China, we've got to deal with it.
It's actually got nothing to do with the capacity. It's about households and our businesses, whether they're prepared to recycle. So if I look at Newham Council, it's gone backwards. It used in 2015-16, they recycled 15-point-something% of their waste. They're now below 15%. That is the challenge. You know, the combined population of Scotland and Wales is smaller than London. London's recycling rate is, I think, averaging about 25%. That's the challenge we're trying to do, and that's why we've been working with organisations like Peabody Trust, Resource London. Of course, the Mayor has got his own strategy that he's consulting on at the moment. There's a massive difference in the population in terms of whether it's about the demographic, the transient nature, the level of owner occupation. So we have a much bigger challenge, I would articulate or suggest, than, of course, and I want to commend Wales and Scotland have improved. The level between Scotland and England is similar.
Have you looked at Milan and how they've managed to dramatically increase their recycling rates despite having transient populations, lots of people in high density housing?
Well, yes, there is a difference, and yes, the team has been out to Milan to see that. They tend to have caretaker blocks. They tend to, I think they pay by weight in terms of the waste that they have. So there's some quite different approaches, but dare I say, there's challenges. Caroline's normally here at the Green Party, run Brighton Hove City Council. Their recycling rate is 27%. And those are the kinds of challenges we need to face, whereas there are some other people here who have much higher.
Councils?
I would say that we need to encourage consumers to do more.
So it's the consumers?
At the end of the day, the householders decide whether they're going to recycle the waste that they generate or not.
Just one.
Sure. I wish more were a bit like Bristol at 43%, but that's behind the England average.
I think it's behind Wakefield as well. But so
Are you saying that by having a sort of
Wakefield's 48%. You're ahead.
There you go, I was right.
Suffolk Coastal, 57%. There we go.
Are you saying that by having a weight-based target, you're incentivising local authorities to collect grass clippings, which could actually be composted in the person's own garden, but it actually suits the council to collect all that heavy garden waste because it just ups their level?
Well, there's a mixture of things going on, Robert. A lot of, and it's fair to say in parts of London that they would suggest they don't have as much garden waste to collect. So that's one of the reasons why they have a low recycling rate. Some councils are now charging for garden waste for a convenience level. In other situations, I think last year, there was a dry summer, the actual weight of the garden waste collected fell, and people have started composting more at home. So you've seen different dynamics going on about what's happening there. At the moment, there's no penalty to councils on their actual recycling rate. Of course, they pay taxes on the basis of how much they send to landfill. But there are some other councils, I do visit and speak to councils quite regularly. I was in Hampshire a couple of weeks ago, where I used to live, and their recycling rate is shockingly low. But they say, we're fantastic because we send hardly anything to landfill, but a lot goes to their incinerator. So that's the different dynamic that's going on.
Okay, thanks.
Is that why they didn't have a recycling of plastics?
They don't take pots and tubs and trays
Okay.
yet. I'm hoping they will change.
Yes, I remember you mentioning them last time round in October.
And the good news is, since I last saw you, is that the Isles of Scilly has started a trial on collecting curbside plastics.
Excellent. That
So
is good
hopefully
news.
Rotherham will take note and do good stuff.
Just before we leave the weight-based targets, I mean, you said it's challenging, you're going to be straining every sinew to meet it. We're going to be meeting following EU targets in this area, are we not, through this transition period, assuming that it happens. What is the target for 2025 or 2030? What is the target? Because it's actually quite important for industry, is it not, in terms of having that long-term signal to invest in the reprocessing capacity here at home?
The proposed target for 2030 is 60%.
And do you think that's sensible?
We think that's going to be challenging. We agreed, certainly for 2030, that again we would try and achieve that. That is still going to be challenging. I'm not going to pretend, and as I've articulated, our biggest challenges are in some of our urban centres.
Okay, thank you. Philip?
I'm going to get on to come back to plastics in a minute, but as you've told many other members what their recycling rate is, do you mind telling me what Shropshire's rate is? I think it's
55%.
Did you say 55? So that would be the highest of any of the colleagues represented.
Well, to be fair,
It's always big houses.
to be fair, I am technically a co-member of the committee, and I'm 57%.
Well, congratulations. congratulations. I think that is achieved substantially by collecting green waste, which, as we've heard,
it will be a
is
significant
perverse,
amount of it, yeah.
or has perverse consequences. And some of the industry representatives yesterday were appealing for us to look at the weight-based measurement, as we've just been discussing. But turning back to plastics, is it the intent of the UK government to support the EU's new plastic strategy?
I have had a brief look at it. I think generally it's really good in the right direction. Of course, I could say, and I know my Secretary of State certainly would say, is that we are already going further on some of these ambitions. So, for example, the EU talks about the intentional use of microplastics will be restricted. We've already started with our initial ban on plastic microbeads, and we're looking further at microplastics. The EU's strategy is that all plastic packaging on the EU market will be recyclable by 2030. Well, actually, most packaging is. I'm not saying it's straightforward, but we've set in place our target by 2025, and that's through RAP. So there's a number of different things where we're actively exploring taxes and charges on the single-use plastics, and we'll have our call for evidence. So there's a number of things where we're absolutely aligned, and I know it's a passion of many people across the European Union, and I'm looking forward to continued collaboration with them. Some of this is going to take quite a lot of R&D, I have to say.
Come on to that in a second. One element of the plastic strategy is for phasing out of poorly sorted plastic material.
Of what sorted?
To phase out poorly sorted plastic material.
Right.
Do we have any plans? Will that form part of the 25-year environment strategy, do you expect?
To be candid, I haven't looked at every bit of the EU document so far. My expectation was I would look at it in a lot more detail before the next Environment Council, but so I'd need to come back to you on that.
Okay. On, as you mentioned, R&D, do you recognise that this, prompted by the Chinese ban, it's created a bit of a watershed moment for how we deal with recyclable material for plastics and fibre in particular? And are you going to use the 25-year environment plan to try and do something a bit more innovative? Because I think the response up until now has been, well, we can recycle this material because, as has been said by Matthew, these are commodity products. We don't have a lot of domestic use or volume here to create our own industry, but perhaps we should do that. So are you looking, for example, at an R&D prize for finding other imaginative uses of plastic recyclable material or fibrous material, or stimulating any kind of scientific endeavour to do more with it, as has happened in other sectors of recyclable?
Well, the analysis we managed to gather from Innovate UK showed that we'd spent about, invested about £50 million on R&D from public money on plastics innovation in the last 7 years. The 25-year environment plan does set out that ambition about working with the research councils and industry. Ultimately, it's got to come from industry, really, being a key partner to this, to bring forward a bid for R&D funding from the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. So that's something that's being actively worked on. The key thing that we want to see is more sustainable materials with a lower environmental impact. Some of this is quite straightforward, and we're seeing quite a lot of action about simple, straightforward stuff to avoid quite quickly. Others, I think, are going to be more challenging. The use of plastic has become endemic across a lot of society and our public services and so on. But even things, dare I say it, like the humble car tyre. We're not going to invent the wheel, and we'll still need that with our electric vehicles. But undoubtedly, the amount of synthetic plastic in there, synthetic rubber, that's one of the things that we'd love to see. I would love to see more research on, and I'm trying to encourage our chief scientific advisors and Department for Transport to go further on this, because it will help with other things like the issue of microplastics getting into our marine environment.
So
Help on air quality too.
So I'm quite encouraged by what you say, but is it focused not just on the front end, new product innovation and different types of packaging materials, but also on how we deal with the legacy at the back end of the stuff that we're already producing?
I don't I'm not entirely sure what you mean by the legacy.
Well,
Sorry,
I mean
do
the
you mean-
existing several hundreds of thousands of tons of waste material, whether plastics or fibrous at the moment, where,
how it
where
can
our
be
markets
used.
are disappearing. So shouldn't we be looking for new uses for that product rather than landfill? Maybe a use is greater incineration, I don't know.
Well, you won't be surprised, having been a minister recently, that I expect your inbox was full of all sorts of innovative ideas on how new processes or new things, in your case the NHS, might want to use in order to achieve. And I regularly get that kind of information. The BEIS is kind of taking the lead on things like the new bioeconomy strategy. There is a lot of interest in the whole biodegradable plastics. I think we need to be careful as we move forward on this. The contamination of non-degradable and biodegradable can lead to kind of, frankly, material problems, literally material problems in the future. So we just need to be careful about how we take this approach as we move forward. But I think, isn't BEIS due to say more on that later this year?
Soon.
Soon, sorry, soon.
Yeah.
I don't know when soon is, but they're working on it.
Industry told us next month, so I don't think...
Oh, there we are, okay.
We'll see how good their intel is.
Right.
Sure.
I mean, somebody once described plastic to me as frozen oil, and obviously if we do more incineration in this country and we get the energy from that, we're displacing fossil fuels that are being burnt in power stations anyway. Have DEFRA done any sort of work looking at the actual overall environmental impact of burning plastic and making new plastic out of the oil that's not going to be used in effect? That's a very simplistic way of putting it, but I mean, there must be some analysis that could be done to see just if that was sustainable, even as a short-term measure when we've got this glut of plastic.
Now, I know the industry hates it when I say this because it doesn't strictly go with the waste hierarchy. Burning plastic, certainly not in an uncontrolled environment, is bad news for the environment, and it is better to bury than it is to burn.
That complies with the Large Combustion Plants Directive, which would then not be producing dioxins and all those other things that can happen if you burn plastic.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to add?
So I'm trying to root through. So I've got some comparison figures between the difference between burning plastic compared to other types of fossil fuel, but I can't actually just quickly get to them. But
we can write to the committee.
Yeah. But it would also depend in terms of the type of fuel. So different energy from waste plants will put different specifications. So often those who are producing energy from waste fuel, the refuse-derived fuel, will do particular mixes, and they will agree that as part of a contract that they send over.
But it would obviously have an impact on our carbon budgets as well. So there's a net impact of +2 tonnes per carbon per every tonne of plastic burned. And paper, I think.
Which is why we're keen to reuse as much plastic as we can.
And just on, and I'm sure your resources and waste strategy will all be about creating markets, sustainable markets for those products, those recycled products to be used in this country. And I'm sure you'll be looking at some of our recommendations on our previous reports. Just on this, I mean, obviously DEFRA's lost 5,000 staff since 2010. How many people are actually working on the resources and waste strategy at the moment?
Chris will know, because it's his team.
Well, enough to deliver it would be my answer to that question.
2, 6, 10?
Well, it will vary because you'll bring lawyers in, you'll bring in analysts. So it will.
We have RAP has very kindly seconded. Is it one person, 2 people?
Yeah.
To help.
Yeah.
One person from RAP seconded, and how many DEFRA civil servants?
So, working exclusively on it. So
Yeah.
I have 9 teams that work to me. So I cover a whole range of different areas, all of which will contribute at some point throughout the next several months while the strategy is being developed to developing that strategy. So I have about 40 people in total in my team. Will they be working all the time on the resource and waste strategy? Probably not, because they will be doing other things like supporting
It's a bit. If I give you the example of the 25-year environment plan, there were 2 people who worked exclusively on the 25-year environment plan, but people from right across the department worked on the 25-year environment plan.
Okay, so perhaps I can rephrase my question. How many civil servants are working exclusively on the resources and waste plan?
nobody works exclusively on the resource and waste strategy. They will all contribute to, so there'll be a lead person who will coordinate the work across my team. And then there will be people individually who have chunks of work that will help to deliver that. So if you wanted me to tot up that right now, I probably couldn't off the top of my head.
So there's one person coordinating it, and how much time do they spend on it? Full time.
Probably about 80% of their time
So
coordinating
there's one
the work.
person coordinating, one person seconded in from RAP, and then everyone else is just putting in bits and bobs.
Well, it's different parts of their role and their objectives during the year.
Yeah, so I disagree with the terminology bits and bobs. They will have specific objectives set to deliver the work. It's not a bits and bobs according to a project plan. So they will each have specific things they deliver in accordance with the plan.
And when can we expect to see that plan?
Well, I would love to say the first half of the year, but to be realistic, sometime this year.
Okay, so I think when you last came in October, we were told June. So is that now?
I would love that to happen. There are different things about how we're approaching some of the work. If we wanted the complete and final answer, we're talking later in the year.
Yeah.
If there were still some elements that we could say we're producing a further particular part of it, because some of this is affecting work across government, then we may be able to do it sooner.
And will you be consulting on it when it's published?
I think we are.
Individual proposals where there might be regulatory changes within the plan.
Will be consulted on.
Yeah.
So there'll be some consultations, alongside.
Yeah.
That's my expectation.
Okay, well, we look forward to... Yeah.
So the consultation that was announced in the budget on plastics, how does that fit in?
The Chancellor announced a call for evidence.
Yeah. Okay, so that's not the same thing as a consultation, I guess. So is that going to be delayed? Is the outcome of that going to be delayed to be tied in with resources and waste strategy, or are we going to see independent action on that beforehand?
I'm expecting you'll see the call for evidence in the near future, and this is part of the challenge about the timetable. And
has the call for evidence not happened?
No.
So it was just announced in the budget and then nothing's happened since?
Oh, stuff has happened, but it hasn't been published, so it hasn't been launched. So a lot of preparation is going on.
Was that they would be going out, looking at the options,
a call for
finding
evidence,
out how they could do it. So the announcement in the budget was a call for evidence, but that bit hasn't actually
The call for
happened.
evidence hasn't happened yet, correct. And we are working on that with the Treasury.
And do you know when it's going to happen?
I'm hoping for that to be in the near future, and that's the kind of thing where, depending on what comes back, in effect, we'll then decide